Welcome, everybody. It's good to be with you. My name is Steve Eastmond. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Pleasant Grove, Utah and Lehi, Utah. Been working in that field for about 20 years, working with individuals and couples and families. And mostly in our practice, we work with individuals who have various kinds of mental health disorders like depression or anxiety, pornography addiction, and others who maybe need marriage counseling, things like that. It's my privilege today to talk with you about depression, and I hope that this will be of benefit to those of you who are tuning in who have a loved one who is struggling with depression, where maybe you're also struggling trying to understand what their experience is like. I want to begin with a quote from Elder Holland, and we'll refer to that now. He says, "I bear witness of that day when loved ones whom we knew to have disabilities and mortality will stand before us glorified and grand, breathtakingly perfect in body and mind. What a thrilling moment that will be. I do not know whether we will be happier for ourselves that we have witnessed such a miracle, or happier for them that they are fully perfect and finally free at last. Until that hour when Christ's consummate gift is evident to us all, may we live by faith, hold fast to hope, and show compassion one to another." With that in mind, I want to talk with you today a little bit about the hope that Elder Holland is referring to. Sometimes when we are a loved one with somebody who has depression, we understand they're struggling a lot, but we don't understand what it is they're struggling with very well. In many cases, it's like a different language, if you will. Just can't quite plug into what's happening if we haven't experienced that ourselves. With what Elder Holland is talking about, there's a need for us to have hope that in the next life things will be better. We also have to have some hope that things can be better now. And if we can understand that language, that can make a difference. And when I speak of it in terms of language, honestly, there is a difference between understanding that a person is depressed and understanding what their experience is like. So again, if we haven't had depression, we're not going to fully comprehend what that situation can feel like for them. As an example, if scientists were to say, we have discovered a new color, and tomorrow we're going to unveil that and show you what that new color is, we would not have any idea what that color would look like, having never seen it before, obviously, until the next day when they actually unveil that color. That kind of lack of information is what it's like for us when a loved one has depression and we haven't experienced it before. In terms of a different language, that experience I can relate to myself. Any of you who maybe have gone on a foreign mission would know what that's like, as well as you're trying to learn a new language in a new country, a new culture. I went to Guatemala, and when I was leaving the MTC, I thought I'm going to be able to speak Spanish when I get there. I had 2 years of Spanish in high school. I had two good months of Spanish training at the Missionary Training Center, and I thought I'll be able to speak Spanish just fine. But then when I got off the plane, I thought they had maybe misdirected the flight to a different country or something. It was not Spanish, I was sure of it. Even the writing on the walls at the airport, I couldn't understand what was going on. I could pick out a few words, but much less to hear the language at all. I just couldn't understand. My first companion was a native, so he spoke Spanish. I spoke English. We didn't fight, but we couldn't understand each other very well, obviously, at all. And on one of the first nights that I was there, we went to a member's home, and he and the sister were talking quite extensively. I was pretending to participate, but could not follow it. And then all of a sudden, things shifted precariously my direction. I could tell she was asking me a question with the inflection in her voice, but to me it sounded much like a Charlie Brown phone call. It was something like this. She turned to me and said, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, and then waited. I knew I was being asked something, but I had no idea what she said, so I just kind of winged it, and I just said, "See." And then she must have worked, because she went forward from there, oh, mm-hmm, turned to my companion, and they began talking again, just that sort of thing. And I had come out unscathed, so I thought, but then the question came back to me again, another one. I thought, well, it worked the first time, so when she said, then again, I said, C. And this time she went, turned to my companion and said, and my companion responded with, and they both laughed, and I could tell it was my expense. I had no idea what they were saying. That's what happens when you don't understand a language. And that kind of inability to relate to a person with depression is very similar in that we just don't know what their experience is. We haven't experienced it, and we have not necessarily yet learned the language. So today I hope that we can go through understanding what depression is, how it operates, how our own thinking operates, so we can see better how maybe another person is, and some things that we can do to support somebody in this. As we'll say several times today, we can't fix it for them. That's something that requires some treatment, but we can do some things to support and to help a person to feel a little bit better in depression. So let's talk now about what depression is. And to do that, I actually want to talk a little bit about what depression isn't and refer to some myths that are pretty common with depression. First one, it's a common myth that people sort of just assume people with depression are crazy, and that is not the case. People with depression have a mental illness, yes, but they're not crazy. They're actually quite capable of understanding what's going on around them. Their perspective is skewed from what depression does, but we will talk about that in a few minutes. But they are not crazy. That kind of myth creates stigma and distance between us and our loved one. Another myth that's very common is that antidepressants are addictive in nature and create a dependency. And that is not the case. Antidepressants aren't any more addictive than, say, insulin would be to a diabetic who needs that. And had we more time, and if the topic were more about addiction, we could discuss those differences. But for our purposes today, it's just important to understand that antidepressants are not addicting in nature. They are to help the brain to correctly distribute the right amount of serotonin, a chemical in the brain that helps us to plug into our emotions better. Another myth is that people with depression are pessimistic. They just need to cheer up and think positively and things will get better. And it's just not that simple. It's not that easy for a person with depression to just think positively. Then we'll talk more about that aspect later, because there are some things associated with a person's thinking that do affect how they feel and do influence depression. But as a rule, it's not just pessimism or that a person just needs to change their attitude and things will be better. Another myth is that depression is synonymous with sadness, that they are the same thing, when they in fact are not the same thing. Sadness is a symptom of depression, but they're not the same thing. Much like, say, having nausea is a symptom of the flu, but it is not the same thing. So we'll discuss a little bit more of symptoms later on as we talk today. But those are a few of the myths that we run into quite commonly with depression, and it causes some distance between us and our loved one. As far as what depression is a physical disorder in as much as it is mental and emotional. It's chemical in nature. And if you think of what happens with chemicals in your own life, you may be able to relate a little bit. If you consider how you feel when you take, say, a sedative or some kind of cold medication that makes you groggy, those chemicals do have an effect on how you feel. Well, now relate that over to what you feel emotionally. Our emotions are plugged into us literally physically based on chemicals that we have in our body. When you're happy, you feel something inside you. Joy in particular, we feel just this feeling just in our chest of elation. It's hard to put words to it. When we feel sad, we may feel a lump in our throat. When we feel nervous, maybe our gut is churning, etc. There are several things that we can experience physically. But depression is an emotion regulation disorder, and it makes it that the chemicals aren't working right. Many of my clients have pointed out they just don't feel like they're even able to plug in to their circumstances. And it creates a real despondency for them as they're with loved ones and they know they're supposed to feel some kind of joy if, say, one of their children is just learning to walk or a grandchild, but they feel nothing. And that creates all kinds of, sometimes a bit of panic or frustration. And as a result, we often see people with depression who will isolate and pull away. They just can't handle that kind of feeling. So as far as depression being something that affects us in that respect, it is important to understand that those chemicals can alter our perception of what is happening around us. There are several disorders that do that. They can be anything from other types of mental disorders to maybe dementia, but it can affect our reality and our picture of what's going on. Some years ago, I worked as a social worker for a home health and hospice company. And in that arena, what we do is visit people in their homes who have some kind of, maybe they've had a surgery or they're recovering from something like that, or they have an illness. And in terms of hospice, they are dealing with an illness, a terminal illness that will take them at some time in the not too distant future. One individual that was on service was an elderly man well into his 90s, and as was the case with many of our patients on service, he had been in farming and ranching and working with cattle and various kinds of things like that. One day, I'd gone to the house to see him, and he had pretty advanced dementia. I'd been visiting with the family and such. And as I was talking to him, he fell asleep there in the chair, and the family said, we need to run an errand for a while, about a half an hour. And I said, well, I'll stay with him. He had had some kind of injury to his hip, and they didn't want him getting up, obviously. So I said, I'll stay here with him and we can chat when you get back. So they left. In the meantime, the nurse came, and then the patient woke up. And he started to try to get out of the chair, and I told him, we'll say his name is Bob. I said, Bob, you need to stay in the chair. And he wasn't having it. He said, well, the cows have gotten out, and I need to get him back into the corral. And I said, no, it's okay. There aren't any cows. We were in his living room. There weren't any cows in the living room, but he got more agitated when I was telling him that there were no cows. He said, yes, there are. They're right here, and they got out, and I've got to get them put back in. He was actually hallucinating them at the moment. Well, the harder I tried to get him to stay in the chair, the more he resisted, and it's amazing how much strength somebody in their 90s has when they're determined to do something, and he was going to get up. So I turned to the nurse, and I said, we better start herding cattle. And she said, what? She didn't have any training in that either. I was a social worker, she was a nurse. We didn't know what we were doing, but we could tell he was seeing cattle. We just needed to go with it if we were going to keep him in his chair. So we started walking around the living room and herding cattle. I don't know what you do. You scare them or you use a whip or something, but we were trying all of that. I just asked him, point out where the cows are and we'll go after him. And it worked. He pointed them out. We ran all over the living room, moving cattle around and bringing them back to the corral, and he stayed in his chair. The brain is powerful in what it tells us is going on. And most of the time it works well for us, but it's hard for us to understand sometimes when another person's perspective is different, and in particular when it's really not logical or even rational compared with what we are experiencing at the time. And looking at what depression is, the other thing that's important to understand is how common it is, how many people experience this kind of difficulty. And that discrepancy they may see between what we consider reality and what they are experiencing is very wide indeed. But the point I want to make is that depression is extremely common. In our country, about 1 in 5 people is dealing with mental illness in general. So 20% of our country struggles with mental illness. When you look at the commonality of depression, the percentage is around 6.7% of the people in the country, according to statistics, would tell us are dealing with depression. That means about a little over a fourth of people with mental illness are struggling with some kind of depression. And that's a lot of people. We're looking at, say, 16 million people who have depression. The sad part is only about a third of those people are getting help, getting treatment of some kind. So a little over 5 million people compared to maybe about 11 million who aren't getting any help at all. And that is a problem. Part of that may be because they don't even realize they have it. They are confused, thinking that they are just sad or just not plugging into their reality, but they're not considering it as a disorder, so they don't realize they need treatment. Other things could be that there's a stigma associated with depression and mental illness that goes back a number of years, and that came maybe beginning with some of the ways we used to understand it and how we used to treat it. There were things like lobotomies or trephination, which is drilling a hole in the skull to let the demons out, or even full-on exorcism to try to exorcise the demons out of a person, when it was depression or mental illness of some kind, not anything else. Those kinds of things have created a general stigma. People didn't want to state they had a mental illness for obvious reasons because of that kind of treatment. So now I want to switch gears a little bit with another thing as we're talking about what depression is. I want to talk to you about how to recognize the symptoms of depression in other people. And what I want to do is go briefly through this because I want to talk more about what you can do and understanding what's happening in the mind of someone with depression. But I do want you to understand that there are different symptoms in children and adolescents and adults and even in the elderly that sometimes can be masked a little bit by different things going on typically in the life of a child or an adolescent or an adult or someone who is in their advanced ages. So let's look at that for a minute so you can see what I mean, and hopefully this will help you if you have a loved one in any of these age groups that you're worried might have some depression. First, with children, one of the symptoms that's really common with kids is vocal outbursts and crying a lot. Now, if we're only looking at one symptom, then it's easy to trip up and think, oh no, my child cries, therefore they have depression. That's not how you diagnose something, and it's not something that I want to teach you to diagnose. It's to just see some things are maybe going on. I ought to take the child in and have him looked at. Well, children cry all the time, and they have vocal outbursts all the time. So by itself, that's normal. What we're looking for is more of a constellation or myriad of symptoms taken together that are a little out of bounds of what you'd normally see with a child. So I'll read off some of these to you. Some things like sadness or mood changes, feelings of helplessness or hopelessness for a child. That's not typical. Social withdrawal, and I don't mean just like sadness, but a regular pattern of pulling away along with some of these other things that we see. Changes in sleep or appetite, increased sensitivity to rejection. When you're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff go on, it's probably a good idea to take the child in maybe to the pediatrician, just have him look and see if there's something maybe going on there. With adolescents, we run into another problem developmentally. A normal milestone is puberty. Well, we know that brings a whole host of different things that we weren't experiencing maybe at 9 or 10, but as the child is coming into teenage years, and it's different for everybody, it's not like clockwork, but they start to have the hormones and it can affect them. So some symptoms of depression overlap with that. For example, changes in personality, mild changes, irritability or angry outbursts, those are common with puberty. But again, taken together in a constellation, you can see some other things that sometimes are more behavioral in nature. Reckless behavior, grades dipping or falling, or maybe acting out at school, even substance use or alcohol abuse, or even running away. These kinds of things are behavioral that maybe the child is really just not doing well internally and is either trying to self-medicate or just reacting to it. Some other things to watch for, again, problems with sleep or appetite, some changes there where you maybe see a lot of weight gain or weight loss, those types of things. Sadness, hopelessness, a lot of ruminating about death or suicide, those kinds of things are obviously signs that the person needs to get in and have a professional look at that. If we move to adults and look at some of the things that we see there, again, some similar characteristics that we've talked about. Sadness, some inability to really connect or relate to people around them very well, a disinterest in things that maybe they were motivated to do before, like say golf or tennis, and now they just have no desire to do those things that really would surprise anybody that knew them, that they're not wanting to do those things. Other symptoms, again, would be sleep and appetite changes that are noticeable, difficulty concentrating, recurring thoughts of death or suicide. Another thing is what we call flat affect, which is just the absence like that of facial expressions, very, very flat in nature, no emotional response to things, even if things are funny. I've seen pictures of people with pretty serious depression. When they smile, you can tell they're not smiling with their eyes. It's just kind of a grin that's sort of faked. Those kinds of things can be signs that a person may be struggling with depression. And when we get to the elderly, we have another problem that with elderly people, there are some common things for just the average individual that also can be symptomatic of depression. Things like insomnia. Many elderly people struggle to sleep. They're up and down throughout the night. Other things might be excessive worry about finances or health concerns, somatic complaints like about their body and how they feel, a hard time concentrating, memory problems. Those sorts of things are common for the elderly anyway, but in depression they can be signs something's going on. But let me give you a couple of other things to look for. Again, sadness or feelings of despair also go with that, and not just on occasion feeling sad in a situation that makes sense that they are sad, but just pervasive, regular sadness. Weight changes, feeling worthless or helpless, preoccupation with death, or a common one for the elderly is a preoccupation with feeling like they are a burden. Many elderly people maybe live with a child, or maybe they lean a lot on their spouse because of physical issues. They just, as they would put it, I can't do what I used to be able to do, and that's very frustrating and can be kind of a fuel for more depression. Overall, with these different categories of people, these age groups, we're looking again at the concept of constellation of symptoms, or several symptoms taken together that may be an indicator that we need to get somebody in for some help. Let's move then from just understanding that somebody might have depression, and let's look at maybe supporting a loved one with depression and what can be done there. As I stated earlier, we're not going to fix this. That's not something that any one of us can just do. We need often professionals or some medications potentially, depending on how serious the case of depression is. And so we need some maybe a doctor's input or a therapist input to have a look at this and see what is going on. As far as what you can do, let me give you a couple of tips. First of all, seek to understand what is happening with this person. It's critical that we try to get information from them. They might not want to talk much, but it's important for us to ask questions and seek understanding. To get them to talk more, it's important that you don't lecture. If we're telling them what to do and telling them how to fix it, they'll more than likely stop talking. So we want to be sure that we're not doing that, but rather asking questions and validating the difficulty of their experience. That will encourage maybe more talking about what they're experiencing, their symptoms, etc. That's in total what we refer to as seeking to understand and getting that information from them. Be supportive, be present, but don't lecture. Avoid minimizing symptoms as well, telling them, oh, it's not that bad, or you just need to get over it, just cheer up, or even thinking of things that maybe they have liked before. It is important to suggest that they do them, and especially to invite them to go with you, because on their own they're not likely to go and do it. If you keep extending invitations, don't give up. Just one day ask them if they'd like to go golfing, or one day ask them if they might want to go and see a movie with you or something like that. And don't give up over time, still inviting them. But recognize that it's probably pretty common they're going to turn you down, but keep the invitations going. Also, another thing that we can do as loved ones is to say regularly how much we love them and how much we're grateful to have them in our lives, that they have been such a great asset to us in our experiences. Those kinds of things, the positive side, as we'll see in a minute when I talk to you about what's happening inside the mind of a person with depression, it's important for them to get some data different from maybe what they're telling themselves in their own personal scripts. In addition, and maybe especially with teenagers, be open to different forms of communication. Teenagers do a lot of texting, social media, those kinds of things, and perhaps that's one way you can interact a little bit more with them. They may want to isolate a lot in their rooms, spend exorbitant amounts of time on their smartphone, which can be a symptom as well for teenagers, something's going on. But you can also try to interact with them that way, as well as in person, calling them on the phone if they're maybe at school or off somewhere else. In addition, I think the most important thing probably for a caregiver is to take care of themselves. It can be an incredible weight. It is a burden for somebody who has a loved one with depression, but one, of course, that we're happy to do because we love that person. But it can be tiring. So it's important maybe sometimes to get somebody who can spell you a little bit, who can maybe take a turn for you, get a friend or a sibling or a spouse or somebody to come and try as well, not just you, in getting them out and about and doing things. With all of that, I want to spend a good portion of time right now talking to you about what goes on inside the mind of a person who has depression. We want to get a glimpse in there because so often either they're not telling you anything, so it's hard to know, or if they do tell us what they're thinking, it doesn't make sense with what we're seeing in our experience. Their view can be very, very skewed, almost like how a prism bends light. Depression bends the meaning of a given situation, and those of us on the outside of that interpretation, we struggle to understand what it is that's going on. So let's look at a model here that I think will make a difference for us in understanding that. And I want you to participate as we go. First of all, I want you just to think of some situation, it doesn't matter what it is, any negative situation or circumstance you've been in, and the resulting emotions from that, which likely are also negative. As an example, my boss got really mad at me today, might be not the greatest situation for us, and as a result, we feel maybe fear, sadness, anger, or guilt. And I ask you, is it likely that the situation or the circumstances caused those emotions? Well, many people would say, yes, they did, but actually no. Our situations and circumstances don't cause the emotion. There's something else that does, and that is our thoughts and our beliefs. Negative thoughts that we use sometimes to interpret a negative situation, and that is what results in those negative emotions. So in this situation that I gave you, my boss got really mad at me today. The negative thoughts might be things like this. My boss hates me. He's going to fire me for sure. And you can see that would result in fear, sadness, anger, or guilt. Another example of that might be your teenager yells at you that you're an awful parent, that you never listen, and that he hates you. Well, that's not going down pleasantly, so your thoughts and your beliefs about that might be something like this. He's probably doing pot. I can't do anything right. He's going to end up in prison, or I'm a failure as a parent. And resulting from that, you're going to get depression, anxiety, anger, those sorts of emotions. Maybe even guilt might come from some of those. When in reality, it's not the situation that causes it. It is the way that we're thinking about that situation. Now, consider this question for just a minute. Could you write down every thought you've had so far today? Now, I don't know what time it is that you are viewing this, but regardless, whether it's the morning or the evening, nobody can write down every thought that they had from the time they woke up until this moment right now. We just don't pay attention like that. We really don't. In fact, for another question for us to consider, is there ever a time that your thoughts just stop and you don't think anything? Well, the answer actually to that is no. Our minds are always filled with something. We don't always pay attention to our thoughts. In fact, psychologists tell us that we're really only purposeful in our thinking or paying attention about 45% of the day. So more than half the day, about 55%, we aren't even paying attention to what goes through our heads. And that's a concern for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But I do ask you this. Where do our thoughts come from if we have not decided to think them first? If you're not the one putting them in there, you're not consciously creating them, then what's the source? Well, I want to use a little model to help you see the source, to understand how that unconscious mind, if you will, really operates. I'm pretty pragmatic, so I like to look at something that's concrete, that makes sense to me. So I put this together hopefully to help you see how it'll operate. This box we're going to have represent one belief. It doesn't matter what that belief might be. A belief is basically a cognitive thought, a deep thought that we use to interpret the world around us. For example, this is one that's probably very common for our audience. Stealing is wrong. Well, where did you get that? That doesn't just kind of come with the territory when you're born, it comes from various kinds of evidence that supports that belief, like parents teaching us, or at school, or the news, things like that. And over time, that becomes very, very strong and reinforced in our life experiences. So let's kind of walk through a scenario on how this might operate. When you walk into Smith's and you're doing some shopping, if you have this belief, you're going to go into Smith's and you're going to get a cart and you're going to walk through and just put stuff in there and then pay for it and leave. But what happens, what comes to your mind if you get out to your car and you're unloading the groceries and then you see it? It's usually like water bottles or toilet paper, something like that in the undercarriage that you forgot to pay for. And then suddenly in your mind pops various kinds of thoughts like, oh no, I better get this in there, I got to pay for this, they're going to think I stole, something like that. And so we get back in the store. But you don't have to consciously tell yourself to think that stuff. Those thoughts just surface. They come up on their own. Same thing would happen if you're coming around aisle 7 in the store and you see this kid and he doesn't see you and he's putting candy bars in his coat pocket. You're going to have some thoughts come from that. He's stealing. He can't do that. That's not okay. So you might go up and intervene, say something to him, or you might go to the manager and say that's not okay. That is how beliefs operate. Those thoughts just come up out of there. These are like lenses through which we interpret our world around us, and the thoughts come up out of there. An example of one that's common with depression is I can't do anything right. Very, very common. In fact, nationwide, it's one of 2 extremely common beliefs. Another one is I'm unlovable. In fact, people think if somebody does love me, there must be something wrong with them because I'm not lovable. In this case, with I can't do anything right, I've had clients come in and they'll tell me, no, Steve, I'm telling you, I really fail everything I do. And so I'll ask them, okay, well, so you fail everything, no exceptions. And they say, yeah, literally everything I do. And so I'll sometimes play with them a little bit and say, okay, so did you get your pants on okay today? Like put both legs down in one side only, or are we able to do that without a problem? And they'll say, well, no, but that doesn't count. Well, that's an interesting point. So I'll ask them, did you drive correctly? Did you get in the wrong side of the car, or did you get in the correct side? And they laugh and they'll say, well, no, that doesn't count either though. So I can get them all the way to lunch and they haven't made any mistakes. But then something happens, like maybe they drop their sandwich or something, and then they'll say, see, there's proof. Can't do anything right. Well, referring to this diagram again, here's the problem. That our beliefs allow evidence in that supports them, but filters out evidence that does not. So we have things come in where we make mistakes, and we can see that readily, but we don't notice the things that we do well. It gets blocked completely out. I remember some time ago back here at BYU in Psychology 101, they showed a video clip, the professor, to our class, and it was one of those big binocular classes. We have some of those here, maybe 200 kids, something like that in the class. And she showed us this video of basketball players, and she said, count how many basketball players are dribbling with their left hand. And then she started the clip. So I'm starting to count these basketball players dribbling with their left hand, and this guy in a gorilla suit walks across the screen and stands in the middle and waves and then goes back off. And I thought, well, that's weird. What does that have to do with these basketball players dribbling with their left hand? But she kept the video clip going. At the end, she asked us, how many of you want to give a number of how many people you saw dribbling with their left hand? People were shouting out 7, 4, however many they counted. And then she said, how many of you saw the gorilla in the middle of the screen? Well, I raised my hand. I thought everybody had seen it, but only about half the class had noticed it. And then she taught the principle, we see what we look for. We see what we look for. We weren't looking for gorillas. We were looking for people dribbling the basketball with their left hand. The rest got filtered out. When we have beliefs like this that form because maybe early on in childhood we make a lot of mistakes, or maybe a friend makes fun of us a lot. Man, you fail everything. You mess everything up. Whatever it might be that generates this, possibly abuse. There are a lot of different ways, but this is common without regard to our background sometimes. We just get these beliefs that develop because of experiences that happen, and that's then the filter through which we look at our world around us. It can cause quite a lot of havoc when you think about it. So that belief needs to be replaced. We'll look back at the diagram again with this. I can do many things well. Well, let's talk about that for just a second. I can't do anything right doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. That I make mistakes is a fact of life for every one of us, every day. But that I fail everything is not even possible. We succeed at things all day long. To say that I do everything perfectly is also irrational, not logical in the slightest. But somewhere in the middle, a balanced way of thinking does make sense. And there's functional happiness right there, a lot of peace of mind. I can do many things well is a good reframe. Now, in order to get that, looking at the diagram again, there's evidence that supports the belief, evidence that goes in there that we can watch for all day long of things we do well, and that will reinforce it. Think of it this way, kind of like in the brain, you have what we call a neural pathway that is a string of neurons that when you think something a lot, it will develop this neural pathway. And each time you think something, it is vascularized, which means it pumps blood through there, and that reinforces that thought. The more you think it, the stronger it gets. After thinking something over and over and over again, it creates what we call a belief or a strong neural pathway. A veritable freeway, if you will, in the brain. So it's almost beyond easy for us in a given situation to pull that lens out of our little filing cabinet in our brain, that belief, and put it in our view window, and then look through that to see how we're going to think, feel, and behave. Or, for another analogy, it's like getting on the freeway. For those of you who are local and really anywhere you live, you could think of it this way in your own town. But from here, from Brigham Young University, if I wanted to go to Salt Lake, those of you who are from this area, how would you get there? What route would you take? Well, it's very automatic. We would just think, well, I'd just get on I-15, I get on the freeway. But you wouldn't think about it. You just get in your car and head that way. I got to go to Salt Lake. So you just drive on the freeway. Well, freeway's closed. Now what route do you take? Well, now you have to think. Well, let's see. I'd go on University Avenue, then take University Parkway, and then maybe go on State Street because I can't get to the freeway. So now we have to really think about it because we're not used to doing that. It requires that effort to get our brain to take a different road. That's how beliefs work. We have a freeway system that says I can't do anything right. And now Steve's saying, no, the new way to think is I can do many things well. And the person turns there and there's no path. There's no neural pathway that's been generated there. It's like standing in front of the Amazon jungle with a machete. And I'm saying, chop, go that way. It's discouraging at first, but when you think this is doable, I just have to just chop through this path, then I'm going to carve things away, then I'm going to get a little grader and grade through, and then I'm going to come through and put gravel down and sand and then pave it, and pretty soon I can have a freeway system. If every day I will look for the evidence that supports my thinking, every day look for the things that I'm doing well, throughout the day watching for them and pulling that evidence in, then I can generate a new belief. And the old one, still there, but becomes easier and easier to turn away from because I now have this new pathway that's becoming a freeway itself. And over time, new thinking can be generated. In depression, you have people with depressive beliefs like these that we see here. I can't do anything right. I'm unlovable. I'm worthless. I am bad. I'm a failure. I'm defective. These are very common things that we run into with people with depression. And it's not just that they're saying it. They fully believe it, and they would have evidence backing it up if you ask them. So to tell them, no, you're not a failure, and you do a lot of things well, initially just saying that, it doesn't sink in. It doesn't generate anything. A person needs to change their belief system. They need to do the work, and that is where professional help can make a difference. Antidepressants can help with some of the chemicals that make it so rigid for them to stick to those beliefs, and counseling helps people to move away from and generate newer beliefs instead of these old ones that can be so destructive. Now I want to shift a little bit from there, not too much, but to talk about common depressive thinking errors. These are not just beliefs, these are more like pervasive patterns of thinking. These are things like maximizing or minimizing. That's one title of a depressive thinking error that we talk about. Maximizing is exaggerating the importance of a given event, And minimizing is downplaying the importance of something that's positive. Examples of that, many years ago, when I was working in St. Louis, I had a client come in who was working at a popular department store there. And she said when she came in one day, "I'm so frustrated and my boss is a Nazi." And she was beyond anxious and upset. I asked her, "Okay, give me a little 1 to 10 scale here. On a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious are you right now?" And she said, "It's a 12. And she was just coming out of her skin about it. I said, "Okay, tell me what happened." And she described the circumstance in that she said, "I work in the men's clothing department. And you know how in department stores they have sometimes like little sidewalks that will separate one department from the next. Well, my department, the men's department, was on this side. On the other side was a totally different department, but there was a sock rack there, and it was all messed up, not organized well at all. Well, I was over here straightening some shirts, and she said the boss came through and yelled at her, didn't even call her by name. He just said, "Hey, you, what is the deal with this sock rack? Get this cleaned up," and then walked on. So didn't call her by name. So right there she was frustrated. And secondly, that it wasn't even her department, but she was in trouble for this mess. So she was saying, her conclusion, my boss is a Nazi. Well, we got talking about it. I said, are there other things that have gone on like that before? Looking for the evidence, what's coming into the belief box, right? Why she thinks that he's that difficult to work with. And she had all kinds of evidences of that. But as far as the other, I said, do you have any evidence that he's not a Nazi? Is there a different explanation maybe for what's going on? And she said, well, I guess there are times maybe when he's kind of nice, but I don't know. I got her thinking about it. She came up with a couple of events, but it was hard. It was hard work for her to go there. But then I said, can you give me a different explanation instead of he's just a Nazi? Let's not go to that extreme, maximizing the circumstance. That's how she'd seen him like all the time. He's just a Nazi. So she looked for that kind of information. But I said, can you give me something else? And she thought, and then all of a sudden the light bulb went on and she said, oh, well, actually the boss, the owner of the department store, was coming to the store that day to inspect it. And I said, okay, so elaborate. I figured where she was going, but I had her talk it through. She said, well, that's probably why he was so upset like that. He probably was really nervous and the sock rack was messed up. And okay, so maybe that's what it was. So I said, if that's true, if that's really the reason for his frustrations like that and why he acted that way, then what makes more sense? That he's just a Nazi? Or does it make more sense that maybe he was really anxious about the department store owner coming to inspect the store, and that's why he acted that way? And she said it's the latter. So then I asked her, and this is the question that matters, rank again your anxiety from 1 to 10. And she said, well, if that's true, that he's just kind of upset and nervous about the department store owner coming, then I'd give it maybe a 2. I'm not that anxious now. Completely changed how she felt. The way we think, these patterns of thought that we can go into do cause us some very big emotional turmoil sometimes. That's what maximizing things can do. It brings on the equalizing emotion that goes with it. He's a Nazi. He's just that bad. Versus he's just kind of agitated today. Well, doesn't require a whole lot of anxiety to deal with. Same thing would be true with depression. Depression and anxiety are twin sisters anyway. They often act very similar in nature, just focused in different directions. Another depressive thinking error that's common for us is all or nothing thinking. It's either black or it's white. It's either good or it's bad. It's pure one way or the other, and there's no gray area in between. So some examples I hear a lot with people with depression are things like, if I'm not happy today, then I'm never going to be happy again. This is never going away. I'm never going to recover. This is the worst thing ever. So you get maximizing as well as this all or nothing. There's no hope for me. I'm never going to overcome this problem. And that is not the case, but that's how they feel. And what happens there? You get the emotional result of that problem. A third type of depressive thinking error is mind reading, assuming that one knows what another person is thinking. We see this a lot, even in spite of depression. We get it a lot. And it is something that I think a lot of people, it drives them nuts when somebody will tell them, I know what you're thinking. I know what's in your mind. I know what you're thinking. We do this with sometimes if like teenagers are dating each other, then we'll see this. Like, I know she doesn't like me. I know she doesn't. She thinks I'm so stupid. And there hasn't even been a conversation between these two, but that kind of thing can go through their mind. So mind reading places in our thoughts where another person might be coming from, and that can create trouble. These thinking errors can be somewhat affected by beliefs that go with them. For example, let's say that I work for a news agency, an internet news agency of some kind. I'm a reporter. And the boss comes in one day and says, hey, Steve, will you write up a report on insurance in our world today, in our community, and get that posted by the end of the day? Well, let's say I have a belief, we'll use the one we talked about a few minutes ago, that I can't do anything right. What am I going to think about my ability to write that report? Well, immediately I'm going to think, oh no, I'm going to mess this up. I'm so going to mess this up. It's going to be the worst report ever. And the boss is probably going to fire me. So it's going to start agitating me already. Depression and anxiety working against me at the same time. But it's my job, so I write the report and I turn it in, and the boss looks it over and he says, good job, Steve. This looks really good. It's exactly what we're looking for. Your data is incorrect here. Just get that fixed. But this is awesome. Fix the data and then let's post it. It's wonderful. Well, first of all, if I have that belief lens, that box that says I can't do anything right, I'm going to filter out any compliments I'm hearing from the boss. So the only thing I'm going to hear is your data's wrong. Well, what does that do? I'm gonna go home, and the family says, well, how are you doing? How was work today? Now I'm going to put words in the boss's mouth. This is the mind reading thing. I know what he's thinking. I know what he's thinking. He's thinking this is the dumbest report ever. This is horrible. So I'm going to tell the family today was horrible. I'm going to get fired. I know it. The boss came in and totally got after me for this report today that I messed up, and told me the data's all horrible and that I need to fix it. I'm just on the edge of getting fired. I know he's going to fire me. I just know it. Well, that is putting words in his mouth. That's the mind reading thing I'm talking about, and it creates the emotional result that goes with it. Anxiety and depression right along with it. A few other examples that I want to give you quickly, again, just to help massage the idea of what we're looking at. For maximizing, could be this. I completely botched that test. Maybe I didn't do well on it. But then look how this goes with maximizing. I'm going to fail this class. I'll never graduate. I'm never going to find a job, and I'm going to be homeless. So we've gone from maybe getting, say, a 75% on a test that we say we botched, all the way to being homeless. That's maximizing. In minimizing, it might be something like this. My boss said he loved my project, but Bob and Phyllis finished their projects too that were tons better than mine. Mine is trash. So then I minimize, even though the boss loved my project, I minimize it because I'm looking at other people's projects and thinking they're great. All or nothing thinking, let's go back to the test idea. I get an 80% on the test and then say, I totally failed it. When really, no, I got a B. 80% is still good. And finally, mind reading, I know that girl totally hates me, like we said before. I know that guy doesn't want to have anything to do with me. And he's just thinking I'm the dumbest person ever. He's not at all attracted to me. These are the kinds of things that we think. In summary of all of this, I want to talk just about this in terms of this concept, the power of perspective, or the way that we see things. Belief boxes and thinking errors are a couple of ways to understand how a person with depression is not seeing things accurately. If you can understand that's what's going on in their mind, that they're not seeing it the same way you are, that'll help you to have some compassion and patience with them. The standard by which we judge other people is based on the way that we see the world ourselves. Well, if we can understand that other people might see it differently, it can help us loosen that up. I may mow my lawn in the straight lines up and down like this every week. And I look across the street and say, what's the matter with Smith over there? He mows the diagonals. Doesn't he know that's weird? The way to do it is straight. Well, what's he thinking? That Eastman, how come he mows his lawn straight? That's weird. The standard by which we judge others is simply how we see it, and we think we're right because it works for us. But other people have different experiences. So understanding that can make a difference. Perspective as a rule is understood as like our world view, how we take everything in with our five senses and with our filters that we've created over the years, or our lenses. And that's influenced by gender differences, life experiences, personality differences, a host of things that create those kinds of filters. Well, I want to run you through this. This is really fun to do in person since we can't do that because of our circumstances, and we're doing this remotely. This will still work. I want you just to tell me what color, from where you sit, what color that is. As I'm doing this with people live, most people would say that they see that as blue. Okay. Well, what would you say if I told you that I thought it was, say, red? Most people would say, well, you're wrong. Okay. Well, then how would you help me see that it really is blue and it's not red? And then people start pointing to things in the room. Well, maybe that painting over there has blue in it, or this person's blue shirt, or the blue in your tie. That goes with that. So if I then agree, yeah, those things are blue, but that's red, then what would you say? In answer to that, most people just give up. They're like, well, okay, think what you want. It's your perspective. So who's right? Is that blue or is that red? Well, that depends on one very important thing. We even say this in our vernacular. From where I sit, or from where I'm standing, that's red. So perspective works that way. I see red, you see blue. Who's right? Both of us. In depression, the challenge we have is that a person's perspective is they're only looking at a small corner of the truth. They are sad. They don't feel well. And that's it. Now, without changing that fact, the rest of the truth, not just the red side of the page, but also the blue side would show, okay, so you're not feeling well. You're not happy. But happiness will come. We can work on this. We can get treatment. We can find things to help. We can help you look at the world a little bit better. And as the person learns how to expand their perspective, it can indeed change the way that they view things. As an example of perspective, I want to look at the scriptures for a minute with 2 Kings 6 and just talk with you about this. I'll read this to you, just have you think about Elisha the prophet. You'll remember this exchange when Elisha is in town with a young man, is really all it refers to this individual as. Now I want to read through just a few verses and have you see the difference in perspective from one person to the next and how Elisha tries to help this individual change his perspective. The scripture reads as follows, "And when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, an host compassed the city both with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do?" Well, there's perspective number one, and I can completely understand that. You're sitting there with Elisha, and a host of bad guys comes around and surrounds the city, and they want to kill you. And they're not going to take prisoners. They just want you gone. So his perspective is they're all going to die. Well, Elisha has a different perspective. He's not missing that piece. He sees it. Yeah, we're surrounded by bad guys that want to kill us. But expanding that and seeing the rest of the story really helps him to calm down. He answered, "Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them." Well, the young man's looking around like, okay, he's lost it. There are two of us, and the whole city is surrounded. So Elisha chooses to help him a little in a way that I encourage all of us to do regularly and consistently until the Lord sees fit to begin to ameliorate some of the symptoms. And Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. That was the rest of the truth. The army was still there. The bad guys were still there. But the rest of the picture was what the young man needed to know in order to not be desperate and in despair in their situation. Perspective which is seriously affected by depression can bend the meaning of things. The existing belief might be, I'm never enough. The situation might be the boss comes in and makes a correction on a report or something. The individual with that belief, I'm never enough, tweaks it. The interpretation is my boss hates me, my work is never enough, I'm going to get fired. When really, again, the truth, the reality still is the boss just made a correction on the report. That's all. There's no statement about firing him, that he's a horrible employee, that he's never enough, any of that. It's just a correction on a report. But the power of perspective can put people into depression. In summary, our beliefs and our thinking errors do contribute a great deal to how we feel about what's going on around us. As loved ones, we need to understand that it happens with us, and we can get kind of in despair ourselves that maybe our loved one is never going to get better when we're getting stuck in our own belief. That might cause us trouble. But also, and more importantly for our purposes today, it's important, brothers and sisters, for us to understand what other people are experiencing, how we can validate them, how we can support them, and get them the help that they need to change those beliefs and those ways of thinking. I testify to you about a Savior who lives, who loves us, and who has atoned for these kinds of things. All of our suffering, He understands perfectly. I testify that He loves us and that there is hope for those with depression and for those of us who love them. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.